If you're a landlord in London and you're not fully up to speed with the tenant fee ban, then this is a really important video for you to watch, so I can share with you some basic information about the tenant fee ban and what it means to you as a landlord. So right now, we have a lot of new legislation heading our way in this industry, but within the tenant fee ban, there are still areas that we can charge for, and it's important that you know, as a self-managing landlord, the areas that you can charge for and what areas are prohibited payments, because the risks of taking prohibited payments are enormous and not something that you should do lightly, or not something you should do through ignorance and not being aware of this situation. So the first thing that you need to know is that from the 1st of June 2019, you can no longer charge for any fees to the tenant on the way into their tenancy, during their tenancy, or at the end of their tenancy. So that's a huge change. So all of the costs that we used to be able to charge for referencing, for check-ins, for check-outs, for administration of tenancy, that is now all prohibited payments. So that cost now needs to be covered, unfortunately, by the landlord and no longer can be covered in any way, shape or form by the tenant. The law also goes deep enough to say that if the if the tenant or the applicant for your property is incurred any costs by bringing a copy of a reference to you, or by having to be asked to complete a reference process before they come to you, that is also considered a levy on the tenant, and it's also a prohibited charge. So that's the first thing you need to be aware of. But obviously we can still charge rent on the property as normal. What we can't do is charge an inflated first month rent to cover the fact that we're losing out on these fees, because unfortunately they've already considered that. So the rent needs to be charged over a 12 monthly period with normal rental payments and no inflated upfront cost. We can obviously still charge for a deposit on a property, but the deposit is now capped at 5 weeks rent. So if you're in a situation currently where you maybe would consider somebody with pets, considered a larger family, consider somebody where their position was maybe not quite as strong as another person, and you wanted to carry a bigger deposit to safeguard yourself against any loss of rent or any damage to your property, you no longer can do that. It's capped at 5 weeks rent. The good news is that if you have a letting prior to the 1st of June 2019 where you have charged more than 5 weeks rent, you can hang on to that rent until at which point a tenancy renewal takes place, and then, believe it or not, you will have to refund the difference. So you can hang on to 5 weeks rent, but if, for example, you took 6 weeks, then on a renewal after the 1st of June 2019, you will need to refund that 1 week's rent. And obviously, with a deposit lodged with one of the government schemes or registered with one of the government schemes, there's a little bit of administration to consider in that. The next thing we can now do is charge a holding deposit. So let's say you do a viewing with an applicant and they say, do you know what, I love the property, I'm really happy to take it. You are now no longer allowed to charge more than 1 week's rent as a holding deposit against that property. The laws goes a little bit deeper, and in the link attached you can read on a little bit more, but also you're only allowed to hold that holding deposit for up to 15 days without seeking prior approval to hold it for an extended period. So that's a consideration if you're letting a property potentially a month before the current tenant moves on. There's another administration consideration there to make sure that you stay the right side of the law. For me, this is a tricky situation, because 1 week's rent, depending on where you are geographically, may not be a huge sum of money, and it may not show full commitment to the property. So again, there may need to be some changes in the way that you now administer your viewings and applications to make sure that this person is committed to your property and doesn't, in effect, walk away with from the property, just leaving you with that 1 week's holding deposit. Other things that you can charge for, you can still charge for late payments on rent, but we're not allowed to start charging now until there's been 14 days of late rent payment. We are allowed to charge 3% above the bank base rate per day of interest, which is something, but it's actually quite a small payment considered against the late rental fee. So again, depending on where you are geographically, that may be a payment that's worth making, it may not. But at least there is still a late payment charge there that you need to put into your tenancy agreements, and then you can go ahead and make that charge. Changes of tenancy. So if there's any change during the tenancy for that tenant, you can absolutely charge for that, but unfortunately it's now capped at £50. So if there's any change at all to that tenancy or renewal to that tenancy, then the cap is now £50, and anything above that is prohibited unless you can provide evidence to support any increase cost. So that's a really key thing to understand. There is a little bit of leeway there, but you need to be able to provide evidence. And at the moment, they're not suggesting what evidence that may be. They're just saying evidence would need to be provided. So that's not been tested yet. We can still charge for early termination of tenancy, which is great. We're encouraged by the government to not charge unless we can demonstrate reasonable reasons for making that charge on early termination. Again, to me that seems a little bit ambiguous and it's not really tested. But as long as we can show reasonable costs incurred for that early termination, then in theory, right now, looking at the government bill, we are still entitled to charge for that. Of course, if you're in a property where bills are not included in the rent, so it's a straightforward let or it's a house share where the tenants are responsible for their own bills, then of course the tenants are still responsible for paying their own bills. So really those are the key areas that you can still make charges. Gladly the rent, charging a deposit capped at 5 weeks, refundable holding deposit of 1 week's rent, late payment charges, early termination fees, and still charging the tenant for, the tenant still being responsible for utility charges. Now I just want to finish off by letting you know the seriousness of this, and again please click on the link below this video to read the whole bill. But the seriousness of the situation is that this is now enforced by trading standards, and actually the first misdemeanour carries a £5,000 levy. So the risk reward here is potentially huge, and very, very damaging fines can be put in place. The first offence is considered a civil offence, the second offence is considered a criminal offence, and actually the local authority then have the right to charge up to £30,000 per misdemeanour. So look, this is something that can't be taken lightly. If you're a self-managing landlord, there's lots of systems that you need to put in place to make sure that you stay the right side of the law. And if you're working with a letting agent, then this is definitely the time to be asking them how they're adapting their systems to make sure that they look after you as the landlord of that property, and also make sure that they're fully up to speed with this legislation and their systems are supporting you and your property. So look, I hope that was useful. The link is below. It is a long read, but it's straight to the government site. I hope that's been useful. I've been Lee from Urban Home.